In the spring of 2020, a transport truck rumbled into the desolate highlands of Wyoming carrying a dangerous cargo. Inside were 50 juvenile golden eagles, hungry and ready to hunt. The biologists opened the crates, and the massive birds took to the sky.
It's been fantastically successful, really good. And they're just starting to explore across the border now. Because of course they don't recognize a line on a map, they're just following the uplands.
Below them lay millions of acres of destroyed land, eaten down to the dirt. Most people thought these birds would just fly away or starve. But they didn't. They went to work. And what they did to that landscape over the next 5 years is something that science is still trying to wrap its head around. The impossible wasteland. Let's rewind to 2019. The red desert highlands of Wyoming looked less like a thriving ecosystem and more like the aftermath of a biological war. We are talking about 2.4 million acres of land that had been chewed down to absolute dust. For over a century, intensive cattle grazing had stripped the land bare, turning what used to be a lush, waist-high prairie into a hard-packed floor of dirt and regret. To call it a degraded ecosystem was the polite scientific term. In reality, it was a catastrophe. The soil had become so compacted from decades of hoof traffic that when it finally did rain, the water didn't soak into the ground. It just skated off the surface, causing flash floods and erosion, taking the little topsoil that remained right along with it. The native grasses, the good stuff like western wheatgrass and blue grama, were gone. In their place, the landscape was choked with invasive cheatgrass. If you know anything about the West, you know cheatgrass is a nightmare. It offers almost zero nutrition to wildlife or livestock, and it dries out so fast that it basically turns the desert into a massive pile of kindling, ready to burn faster than a Tesla in a parking garage. Ranchers were at their breaking point. This wasn't just an environmental issue, it was an economic crisis. To support a single cow, they needed more and more acreage because the forage quality had nosedived. It was a slow-motion disaster. Everyone could see it happening. The cows were getting thinner, the grass was getting scarcer, and the profit margins were disappearing into the dust. But nobody knew how to stop it. The land was stuck in a death spiral. Enter the Wyoming Game and Fish Department with a plan so bonkers that half the ranching community thought the biologists had lost their minds. The proposal was simple on paper, but terrifying in practice. Reintroduce 500 golden eagles into the region over a 5-year period. Now, pause for a second and think about that. They weren't suggesting planting seeds or building irrigation canals. They were suggesting releasing 500 apex predators with 7-foot wingspans and talons capable of punching through a coyote's skull. This wasn't for some feel-good conservation photo op. They claimed this was a functional tool for ecosystem restoration. You can imagine the reaction at the town halls. The meetings were heated, to put it lightly. These ranchers were already dealing with thin margins, dying grass, and harsh winters. The last thing they wanted was a sky full of raptors that looked at a newborn calf and saw a potential snack. One rancher stood up and said, "You want me to believe that adding more things that can hunt my livestock is going to help me? That is like saying the solution to my broken truck is setting it on fire." And honestly, it was a fair point. On the surface, it made zero sense. But here is the catch. The biologists had done their homework, and they knew something the ranchers didn't. They knew that the root cause of the destruction wasn't just the cattle. It was an imbalance involving a completely different animal, one that was currently destroying the ground from below, while the cattle destroyed it from above. The biologists were betting everything on a concept called a trophic cascade. It is a fancy term for what happens when you put the boss back in charge. But to make this work, they had to target an animal that most people think is cute, but in reality was acting like a biological bulldozer. But the ranchers weren't ready to hear it. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The state was asking them to trust a predator to save their prey. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and if it went wrong, it wouldn't just be the ecosystem that collapsed. It would be the entire local economy. The clock was ticking, and the first truckload of eagles was already on its way, bringing with it a change that nobody was prepared for. The underground enemy. So here is the deal. To understand why they needed eagles, you have to understand the prairie dog. Now, before you picture cute little rodents standing on their hind legs looking adorable for tourists, you need to understand what prairie dogs actually do to a landscape. They are ecosystem engineers. A single prairie dog town can span hundreds of acres and contain thousands of animals. They dig constantly. In a healthy ecosystem, this is actually a good thing. Their tunnel systems aerate the soil, allowing water to penetrate deep into the earth instead of running off. Their waste fertilizes the ground. They clip vegetation, which sounds bad, but it actually stimulates new growth and prevents any single plant species from dominating. In a balanced world, the prairie dog is a hero. But the red desert was not a balanced world. It was broken. When cattle overgraze an area, the grass gets short. Prairie dogs love short grass because it lets them spot predators from a distance. So, when the cows chewed the grass down, the prairie dogs moved in and thrived. It was a perfect storm. But here is the kicker. Without natural predators, prairie dog populations explode exponentially. A healthy prairie dog town might have 10 to 15 animals per acre. In the red desert, without any checks on their population, that number was hitting 50 or 60 animals per acre. At those densities, they aren't helping the ecosystem anymore. They are strip mining it. They consume so much vegetation that the native grasses can't recover. They outcompete the cattle for every single blade of green. Their colonies became so expansive that they effectively turned the pasture into a lunar landscape. It creates a paradox. The very animals that could help heal the ecosystem become the thing preventing it from healing. They were locking the land in a state of degradation. And it wasn't just the prairie dogs. The ecosystem was missing its immune system. In the past, wolves, mountain lions, and bears kept these populations in check. But wolves had been nearly eliminated from the region decades ago. Mountain lions kept to the rockier, higher terrain. That left the door wide open for another player, the coyote. With the big predators gone, coyote populations had skyrocketed. Now you might think, wait, coyotes eat prairie dogs, right? They do, but they are opportunists. In the degraded highlands, coyotes found an easier meal ticket. They were hammering the populations of pronghorn antelope and mule deer. Wyoming's pronghorn population, which once numbered over 1 million, had dropped to around 400,000. Mule deer were in a similar freefall. Biologists had pointed fingers at habitat loss, disease, and harsh winters. All true. But predation on fawns by an unchecked coyote population was a massive, underappreciated factor. In some areas, up to 80% of pronghorn fawns weren't making it past their first month of life. So, look at the board. Wyoming had a cascade of disasters. Overgrazed land that couldn't hold water, exploding prairie dog populations that were eating the roots of the recovery, and coyote populations that were decimating the wildlife that brings in hunting revenue and tourism. The Eagle Reintroduction Plan was designed to target all of these problems at once. It was a three-dimensional chess move in a world of checkers. The skeptics thought it was too ambitious. They said nature doesn't work like a predictable machine where you pull one lever and get the result you want. But the biologists knew that the golden eagle is not just a bird. It is the ultimate biological weapon. A golden eagle can spot a prairie dog from 2 miles away. Their eyesight is 8 times sharper than a human's. They can dive at speeds of up to 200 miles per hour. They are the drone strikes of the animal kingdom. The plan was set. The first batch of birds was acclimated in large flight enclosures for 3 weeks. This was to reduce the shock of the new environment and ensure they didn't just fly back to where they came from. The biologists held their breath. They opened the gates. 50 eagles launched into the air, casting shadows over the broken land. For the first few months, silence fell over the desert, and it seemed like the critics were right until the data started coming in. The shadow of fear. The first wave of eagles was released in the spring of 2020. These were 50 juveniles, each fitted with solar-powered GPS tracking units, so biologists could monitor every flap of their wings, every hunt, and every roosting spot. They were sourced from areas where populations were stable and could handle the removal. At first, honestly, not much happened. The eagles scattered. They spent time establishing territories, fighting for airspace, and learning the landscape. Some died. That was expected. Juvenile eagle mortality in the wild hovers around 50% in the first year. Nature is brutal, and not every bird makes the cut, but enough of them survived. And by the fall of 2020, the biologists noticed a strange anomaly in their monitoring data. They looked at the prairie dog towns in the areas where the eagles had set up shop. The activity levels had dropped by 40%. Now, here is what most people don't realize. It wasn't because the eagles had eaten 40% of the prairie dogs. A golden eagle is a voracious eater, sure, but it can only eat so much. Physically, it was impossible for 50 birds to eat that many rodents. So what was happening? This is where the concept of the landscape of fear comes into play. It is one of the most powerful ecological forces on the planet, and yet nobody talks about it. Prey animals don't just react to predators when they are being actively hunted. They react to the possibility of being hunted. When an apex predator moves into the neighborhood, the prey changes its entire lifestyle. The prairie dogs knew the eagles were there. They could see the shadows. They could hear the wind through the feathers. So, instead of spending 12 hours a day above ground, clipping grass and expanding their tunnels, they started spending 20 hours a day underground. They stuck closer to their burrow entrances. They stopped foraging in the outlying areas. Their colonies naturally contracted. They were essentially locked down in their bunkers. With the prairie dogs spending more time underground and less time acting like lawnmowers, something remarkable happened. The pressure came off the plants. The grass started coming back. It wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't everywhere, but in patches across the highlands directly underneath the eagle patrol zones, green shoots began to push through the crust. And we aren't talking about cheatgrass. We are talking about the return of native perennials. Plants like Indian ricegrass and needle and thread grass began to emerge. These are species with deep, complex root systems that hold the soil together and survive drought conditions. Then came spring of 2021. The state released another 100 birds. By now, some of the 2020 juveniles were reaching maturity. They were pairing off. Golden eagles mate for life, and they defend their territories aggressively. This meant the zone of fear was expanding. It wasn't just spots on a map anymore. It was a blanket of pressure covering the highlands. More prairie dog towns came under the shadow. And with the rodent numbers dropping toward ecologically balanced levels, back down to that sweet spot of 10 or 15 per acre, the vegetation response accelerated. But the eagles weren't just looking down. They were looking sideways too. They started hammering the coyote population. Now, a golden eagle typically won't take on a full-grown, healthy adult coyote. That is a fight that could end badly for the bird. But juvenile coyotes? They are fair game. And just like the prairie dogs, the adult coyotes changed their behavior. They became strictly nocturnal. They stopped hunting in the open during the day because they learned that the sky had eyes. This relieved the pressure on the pronghorn and mule deer fawns. Suddenly, the fawns had a window of safety during the daylight hours to feed and grow. Survival rates began to tick upward. The ecosystem was waking up from a coma. The flow of energy was starting to move correctly through the food web. The sun fed the grass fed the cows and the deer, the predators managed the grazers, and the soil began to heal. But the ranchers were still watching from the fence lines, skeptical. They needed proof that this wasn't just a biological science fair project. They needed to see it in their bank accounts. And then came the weigh-in day that shocked the entire county. The green gold rush. Ranchers live and die by a simple metric: weight. The heavier the cow when it goes to market, the more money in the pocket. It is a brutal, thin-margin business where every pound counts. In the autumn of 2021, a fourth-generation cattle operator named Bill McCready started noticing something weird. His herd looked robust. Usually, by the end of the grazing season in the highlands, the cattle are leaner. They have spent months walking miles and miles over hard dirt to find scraps of dry cheatgrass. They burn almost as many calories finding food as they get from eating it. But this year, the cows were rounder. Their coats were shinier. Their body condition scores, basically the bovine equivalent of a BMI check, were significantly higher than the previous 5 years. At first, Bill thought it was just a fluke. Maybe the weather had been better? But looking at the logs, 2021 wasn't particularly wet. It wasn't mild. It was a standard, harsh Wyoming year. The only thing that had changed was the forage quality. Here is the science behind the profit. When you have nothing but cheatgrass, cattle have to work incredibly hard for minimal protein. It is like trying to survive by eating celery. You spend more energy chewing than you get back. But when the native perennial grasses returned, thanks to the prairie dogs being on lockdown, the equation flipped. Native grasses are nutrient-dense. They are the steak dinner compared to the cheatgrass celery. Cattle can graze a smaller area and get more nutrition out of it. Less walking means less energy burned. More energy conserved means more weight gain. It is simple thermodynamics. Bill ran the numbers, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His herd averaged 60 pounds more per animal at market weight compared to 2019. Over a herd of 500 head of cattle, that translated to 30,000 additional pounds of sellable beef. At $1.50 per pound, that is $45,000 in extra revenue. For a family ranch operating on the edge, that isn't just significant, it is life-changing. That is a new tractor. That is paying off the loan. That is the difference between selling the land and keeping it in the family for another generation. Bill McCready, the guy who had stood in the town hall shouting about predators, went to a state wildlife commission meeting in early 2024. The room went quiet when he walked up to the microphone. "I am not going to stand here and tell you I love having eagles around," he said, his voice gruff. "They are predators. They make me nervous. But my grass is better than it has been in my lifetime. My cattle are healthier, and I am making more money. If that is what it takes, I will deal with the eagles." Other ranchers started echoing the sentiment. The economic reality had crushed the skepticism. By 2022, Bill was seeing wildflowers he hadn't seen since he was a kid. Lupine, balsam root, prairie coneflower. These aren't just pretty flowers. They are indicators of deep soil health. They hold moisture. They attract pollinators. They signal that the land is actually working again. By 2023, Wyoming had released 350 eagles total. The ecological cascade was undeniable. Native grass cover had increased by an average of 35% in the eagle zones. Pronghorn fawn survival had jumped from 20% to 48%. The skeptics were running out of ammo. The program cost $8.2 million over 5 years. That sounds like a lot of taxpayer money until you look at the return on investment. The increased cattle productivity across the region generated an estimated $30 million in additional ranch revenue during that same period. The birds paid for themselves nearly 4 times over. And that is not even counting the value of carbon sequestration, water filtration, and tourism. But just when everyone thought they had the formula figured out, the ecosystem threw one final curveball. The return of the eagles didn't just bring back the grass and the cows. It brought back something that had been missing for generations, proving that nature is far more connected than we ever imagined. The final piece of the puzzle was about to land, and it would change the map of the West forever. The resurrection of the wild. We often talk about nature as if it is a collection of separate parts. You have the soil, the water, the predators, the prey. But the Wyoming experiment proved that nature is actually a singular fluid machine. When you fix the engine, the whole car runs better. By late 2024, the project had hit its target. 500 eagles had been released. The population wasn't exactly 500. Nature is messy, birds disperse, and accidents happen. But the highlands now hosted a stable breeding population of around 220 golden eagles. This created a ripple effect that went far beyond cows and grass. With the native sagebrush ecosystem recovering, the sage grouse populations began to rebound. Sage grouse are what biologists call an indicator species. They are the canary in the coal mine. If they are dying, the land is dying. If they are thriving, the land is healthy. After years of terrifying decline, sage grouse numbers in the Red Desert were up 18%, and the predators attracted company. Diverse predator communities are more stable. Ferruginous hawks, prairie falcons, and even a few bald eagles started moving into the territory. They weren't competing. They were partitioning the resources. The hawks hunted the ground squirrels, the eagles managed the prairie dogs and coyotes, and the falcons took the smaller birds. It created overlapping layers of that landscape of fear we talked about, keeping the prey populations dynamic but healthy. Biologists started using the Wyoming project as a blueprint for the entire American West. Montana expressed interest. Parts of Colorado and New Mexico began feasibility studies. The fundamental insight was simple but profound. Apex predators aren't just nice-to-haves. They are the operating system of the wild. Think about the wolves in Yellowstone. When wolves were reintroduced, they didn't just eat elk, they changed elk behavior, which allowed willow and aspen trees to recover on the riverbanks. The roots of those trees stabilized the soil, which stopped the riverbanks from collapsing. The wolves actually changed the geography of the rivers. Wyoming's eagles did the exact same thing for the grasslands. They didn't just eat rodents. They changed rodent behavior, which allowed grass to recover, which improved cattle health, which saved the ranchers, which prevented the land from being sold off to developers. It is a term called a trophic cascade. It means the effects flow downward through the food web like a waterfall. But let's be real for a second. It is not a fairy tale. Challenges remain. Climate change is making droughts in the West more severe. Invasive cheatgrass is a stubborn enemy that will never be 100% gone. The highlands won't return to some pristine pre-settlement paradise overnight. But what Wyoming proved is that we don't have to just watch the world degrade. We don't have to accept that our farmlands and wildlands are doomed to turn into dust. Strategic reintroduction of the right animals can jumpstart recovery in ways that 40 years of bulldozers and chemical sprays never could. The ranchers win. The wildlife wins. And a landscape that looked like the surface of Mars is finally starting to look like Wyoming again. So, here is the question you have to ask yourself. If a bird can fix 1 million acres of desert and save a crashing economy, what other villains of nature have we misunderstood? Are we eliminating the very things that are trying to save us? Nature has a funny way of solving problems we think are impossible, doesn't it? It turns out the cure for a dying landscape was soaring overhead the whole time. If you want to see more stories about how nature is fighting back and winning, smash that like button and subscribe. What animal do you think we should bring back next? Let me know in the comments.